just to, kind of reiterate, we have our value spectrum established, and then we've established the series of gray squares that we're going to overlay blue into. And as you can see, I've already done that. And that in adding the blue, what we get is this really nice spectrum of blue grays that we can then see, that there is this desaturation of that color blue from the corner here where it's fully saturated to here where it's really barely saturated. And so what I can actually do with these is I can add a little bit of extra blue into these squares, and that will just help you further understand what I did. And so when I was filling in the blue for these squares, I was working column by column. And so if you think about this column right here, we have really minimal amounts of white and black here, all the way down to here where we have a really extreme amount of white. And so what I did is I just laid some blue in each square, just like this, and began and blended each one. And so I'll show you what that blending looks like here. I can actually add, it's okay for me to be adding a little bit more blue to this square because this square should be a slightly brighter blue. But then what you can see is when we have this blue square next to these blue squares, that we can see that it's a little bit more gray. So it's a little bit less saturated than this bright blue one. And I'll actually add a little bit more blue to that. Perfect. And then as we go down the line, I'm gonna need gradually less blue as I get down to the bottom here. So I already added a tiny little bit there. I'm actually not even gonna touch that square. I'm just gonna leave it. I'm going to blend a little bit more blue into this square here. And then I'm just going to take what was left on my finger and kind of blend it into this square a little bit. And then this square I can really actually just leave alone. And so what we have now is this second column where instead of just the pure blue, what we have is a little bit of black and then gradually increasing amounts of white. And so we get just that subtle tone of gray added to that bright blue. Let's go ahead and go to the next column. I'm going to do the same thing here where I'm going to add a little bit more blue to these top squares. And so this square here is going to look a lot like that square, but the only difference is that we only have black in that square, whereas we're adding a tiny bit of white to this square, and that is also just this gradual shift that we see moving down the line. And so we're desaturating that color. Percentage-wise, there's really less blue here, more gray, more black. One thing that you'll find is these squares in the middle will begin to look a little bit similar because we're right in that middle ground of having, black and white. And so they will look pretty similar, but even if I were to juxtapose these two squares, this square has more black and less white because we're on the third square of black but only the second square of white, and so I can tell that that one has a little bit more black in it, whereas this one we're on the second square of black but the third square of white, so this one's a little bit lighter. And so tonally those things are pretty apparent as you are working. And so if you're seeing that, excellent, and if you're not seeing that, then go ahead and begin to add a little bit more black, a little bit more white to begin to reveal that tonal range. And so I'm going to go ahead and add, if we're working on our third column now, I'm going to add a little bit more blue to this one. One thing that's important to note as you're working is that the white is going to quickly be eclipsed by the blue and especially by the black. And so you just want to be careful as you're working on these lower ones that you're not carrying too much black down into those squares, especially these two earlier squares, because they're going to need a lot of white, and even just a little touch of black can end up kind of throwing that color off. And so you just have to be kind of careful about that as you are working. And so again, you know, these two squares are beginning to look kind of similar, but this has a little bit of white in it. And so it's going to be a little bit different than that square above it. And so then again, you know, you can see if we look on this diagonal from the super saturated blue to this gradually grayer blue that we have at the bottom here. So with that, I'm gonna let you guys work. And if you have any questions as you are working on this, let me know. And so again, just to reiterate, we have the most white here and the most black here. And so like this square, for example, has a lot of white and only a little bit of black in it. This square still has the same amount of white, but a little bit more black. Same amount of white, but even more black, and then the same amount of white and a lot of black, so that's where we get that gray. And if we look at this column here, here we have a lot of black and a little bit of white. A lot of black and a little bit more white. A lot of black, but now we're seeing a lot more white as well. And then finally, in that corner here, we have that perfectly even middle ground of gray. And so keep working on this. I'll be looking at your pieces as you're working, just to, you know, confirm that you're understanding this process. And I will make another video where I will start from scratch with those colors if that seems to be necessary. And so then one last thing to note before in terms of finishing this piece up, is that what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this paper outside and I'm just going to lightly blow on it or kind of wave it in the wind to get all of this extra you know, media off of my paper. The last thing that I want to do is brush all of that media, because that's just going to blur all of the beautiful spectrum of colors that I have just established. And I really don't, you know, obviously don't want to do that. And so for this assignment, you're going to do this 6 times. So you're going to do it with each of the primary and secondary colors. And so as you are working, I will see how you're doing.